Hi, I'm Alex McAdams, and I'm a physics programmer working on Chaos Cloth for Unreal Engine. Before coming to Epic, I was an engineer at Disney Animation, also working on hair and cloth simulation. I worked with Jared Monson on Series Cloth for the Witcher 4 Unreal 5 tech demo, and we're excited to use this experience to share some of the best practices for using Chaos Cloth in AAA game workflows. It's just a quick video to remind you of what the cloth looked like. So in this talk, we're going to go through the process of setting up cloth assets for a game, from design to rigging and in-game controls, with the inevitable compromises that you end up making when under project deadlines. So before you start building your cloth asset, you'll need to consider both artistic and performance goals for your cloth. Oftentimes, this process starts with concept art, like this, sometimes with a few variations. Now can be a good time to raise potential simulation issues and brainstorm solutions. For example, this version of Series Cloak has a lot of small folds that can pose simulation challenges, both in terms of resolution required to simulate the folds, as well as the number of potential self-collision issues. Thankfully, a heavier, simpler to simulate version was ultimately chosen. Now, when determining the level of detail we want to include in our simulation proxy mesh, we need to consider both performance targets and art directions. In particular, for Siri, we had a budget of under 1 millisecond on PS5, and we knew that her cloak was made from long, heavy material. Furthermore, we had to prepare for complex collisions between Siri's body, swords, and the horse. While Chaos Cloth has a wide range of features to support anything from real-time game simulations up to cinematic quality cloth, we'll be focusing on which settings are appropriate for game quality cloth in this talk. In particular, when targeting a typical game, we recommend simulation meshes with a resolution of around 200 to 600 simulated vertices. Significantly more vertices can push into the cinematic cloth quality, which can require more complex setups. For setups with a typical level of features for cloaks and capes and things like that, we tend to recommend around 350 simulated vertices. This allows for enough degrees of freedom while staying in a half to 1 millisecond range on current generation hardware. I also wanted to highlight that for 5.6, we've done some optimization targeting platforms such as mobile, and have found that around 200 simulated vertices works well, coming in at around 1 millisecond per frame on these platforms. So once we've got the specifications for our cloth asset, it's time to rig it. One of the first inputs you'll need to generate for your cloth asset is your simulation proxy mesh. We've talked a bit about the recommended resolution, but we also need to consider things like edge flow. The main thing to remember when creating your simulation mesh is that cloth can only bend along mesh edges. At cinematic quality, this can have an effect on wrinkle bias, but mostly you have enough degrees of freedom to bend any way you want. On the other hand, on this game quality, edge flow will have a real effect on the bulk behavior of your simulation. The right image here, it shows the simulation proxy we used for Series Cloak, and we found that similar quad-based meshes with attention to diagonal triangulation tends to work well when making similar cloaks and capes. We have a few different ways to import your meshes into the cloth asset, but one that gives the most control is by importing from a skeletal mesh. The cloth asset will import both the mesh geometry as well as any normals, UVs, skin weights, and render colors and materials. And new in 5.6, we also support importing simulation morph targets. Another type of asset you author outside of the cloth editor and import in is the physics asset. This asset contains kinematic collision bodies for the simulation that are driven by a skeletal mesh. While the physics asset supports a range of types of collisions, including convexes and skin meshes, We recommend using simple rounded primitives like this, so tapered capsules, capsules, and spheres wherever possible. They're both performant, and they lack corners that can cause snags. Once you have these assets, we'll use the Chaos Cloth editor to do the rest of our cloth asset rigging. The core of the Chaos Cloth editor is a data flow graph. This node graph is a construction graph made up of nodes corresponding to operations like adding constraints, remeshing, painting weight maps, or editing solver settings. The terminal node of the graph compiles this data into the final cloth asset. The editor has two viewports, which you can see here. The construction viewport, by default, is on the left, and it corresponds with the state of the asset up to the currently selected node. From here, we can view the asset's three sets of geometry: the render geometry, the 3D simulation proxy, and a 2D panel-based version of the simulation proxy. The right-hand viewport is what we call the simulation viewport and can be used to preview your cloth asset with optional animations, and also that's where our simulation debug display is. If you're familiar with the skeletal mesh-based cloth editor, this corresponds with the viewport there. If you're interested in learning more about how to use data flow, I'd recommend you check out the non-destructive workflows for chaos physics in UE5 session later this afternoon. Now, Chaos Cloth offers several types of constraints, but some of the biggest decision points are which constraint types to use for stretching, bending, and self-collisions. So I'm going to walk through these options and our recommendations for game assets. On both our stretch and bend simulation nodes, one of the properties you'll find is solver type, with the option of PBD or XPBD. For assets with the resolution we're using here, we recommend using PBD. It's computationally fast and has a simple to author 0 to 1 stiffness values. The main feature that XPBD offers is constraint damping, but we found this feature is more useful for the high resolution cinematic quality cloth with high subframe counts. Now let's take a look a little bit more at our stretch constraints. The first checkbox you'll see is whether or not to use 3D rest links. You want to keep this checked on unless you have a simulation mesh that was authored in a panel-based cloth editing package that can be used to generate a size 2D mesh. So the top is an example where we do have that 2D panel mesh that's the correct size. But in our case, we have just a simulation mesh that was generated from the 3D render mesh, so we'll be using the 3D rest links. Once you've done those first two selections, you can also have the option to add an area constraint, which can add extra stability to the simulation. I recommend adding it depending on which bending model you choose, so I'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit. The last stretch constraint option I wanted to highlight was enable stretch, warp, and weft scale. This allows you to change the rest length of the mesh at runtime. So that was stretch constraints. Now let's take a look at bending constraints. The big choice you have is between what we call hinge or faces spring. The hinge constraint is an angle constraint on each edge of the mesh. The faces spring is a spring that connects opposite vertices from an edge. So the hinge is like the constraint on the blue, and the faces spring is the red spring. Hinge constraints are good at holding a specific angle and work well for cloth that has a lot of structure. We use them on series hood for this reason. One drawback of the hinge constraint is it can be less stable under a lot of stretching. And this is part of why we like to use it with the area constraint I mentioned before. The faces spring constraint is good for softer, more dynamic objects like the cloak. This constraint is very cheap and stable, but it can't hold specific angles as well. So the final simulation property choice I wanted to talk about is our self-collision options. The most expensive option is the full self-collisions with self-intersection detection. This is all the bells and whistles with per vertex thickness, full layering, and intersection resolution. But it can be very expensive, and it would have completely blown up our sub-millisecond budget. For this reason, we have a much cheaper self-collision sphere repulsions. The simple repulsion spheres, they're cheap to calculate, but they don't know how to untangle the cloth if they all pass through each other. This is where our new cloth-cloth constraints can come in handy. Cloth-cloth constraints allow you to generate springs between arbitrary cloth points. Currently in 5.6, we have a few different procedural methods to calibrate these constraints within the cloth editor. The main feature that makes these useful for supporting self-collisions is that you have a separate compression versus extension stiffness. So in the case of series cloak, we set the springs to only engage when they shorten beyond an initial configuration. This keeps the cloak from collapsing in on itself while remaining free to expand out. The last configuration node I wanted to talk about is our solver settings. Solver settings control how each frame is subdivided. The first level of this subdivision is the number of substeps per frame. In this case, we have 2 substeps per frame, denoted in orange, where the total cost of the frame is equal to the substep cost plus a fixed frame setup and finalized cost. Each substep is further divided by a number of iterations. Here we have 2 red iterations per substep. Similar to the frame level, there's also an additional cost per substep, where we advance time for kinematic objects, as well as set up self-collisions. We recommend starting out with a minimum of 1 substep, one iteration and 1 substep, and testing with it, only increasing substeps and iterations to improve fidelity. In particular, if you find you're missing collisions, increasing substeps can help. Substeps are also helpful when improving constraint convergence, for example, reducing stretchiness. Increasing substeps will also reduce the amount of numerical damping in your simulation, which can make the cloth overactive at higher substep counts. This is why we have that XPBD constraint that I mentioned earlier. One way to increase convergence without this effect is to instead increase the number of iterations. Increasing iterations tend to be less effective at improving overall convergence than the equivalent number of substeps, so it may take some experimentation to find the right balance. However, in this case of series cloak, we use 2 substeps and 2 iterations, which tend to be common for simulation meshes of the size and weight, especially when you have the more complex collisions that we had. So that's it for the basic cloth asset rigging guidelines. Now I'd like to hand it over to Jared to explain how to take these building blocks and build a game-ready cloth setup.
All right, thank you, Alex. My name is Jared Monson. I'm a senior technical animator at Epic and was working with Alex, obviously, here on the cloth. It's awesome when you have good engineers because it makes my job a lot easier. And when I say, hey, I need this thing, the physics engineers are great and are able to give me the things that I need most of the time. So, all right, so for my portion of the talk, I'm going to kind of focus a little bit more on conceptual things and not so much on like individual nodes and settings, simply because I feel like everybody's projects is going to be different, and what settings or values might work for me may or may not work for you. But we do have similar problems, and so I want to, like I said, focus a little bit more on approach and some of the things that I use to help solve some of those problems. There's a lot of great docs and even other talks as well, both here at this conference and online, as far as helping you get a little bit more into some of those individual nodes and settings. So I definitely recommend checking those out. So let's move on. So we learned a lot, obviously, in this demo and how cloth can work in a more game type scenario and production environment. So what I wanted to do was kind of break my area into these focus areas, and I feel like each of these areas is pretty important to help you solve problems that you might have. So something that I'm calling the cloth controller function. We'll talk about the velocity scale node, your animesh poses, attribute maps, and then also the editor CVARs to help you debug and see what's going on in your cloth setups. Before we get too much further, though, I did want to talk about the kind of important and how it's important to understand the difference between the cloth component and the cloth interactor. The cloth component is the component itself, and those it sets component level attributes that affect the whole cloth, like adding and remove collisions, teleports, resets. It handles whether it collides with environmental objects and things like that. So it's more of the global values. And then the interactor is what you need to set dynamic values in the cloth asset itself. So these are the things where I want to change, velocity, scale, or friction, or dampening, or any of those things. And that's the variable or interactor is what you need to help set those on the fly. And to get the interactor, you start with the component. It's derived from the component itself, and then you can set, like up here, there I have an example of setting friction. So the cloth interactor is really important to have. That's the thing that we set it. So let's start off talking about the cloth controller function. This is, like I said, it's the heart of the cloth setup, and it's basically a state machine for Siri as she walks around. So this function, I realized that one set of values just wasn't going to work for all the different things that Siri was doing, whether walking, running, on the horse. There were certain scenarios, like when she was on the Vista, and we needed some more dynamic wind, that just one set of values is just not going to work. So what this function does is basically go through, and depending on what she's doing, it sets certain states, and then based off those states, I set cloth values. For this demo, I essentially split this into two functions, one that set the current state, and then one that set the values based off the current state. And for this demo, she didn't do any combat or anything, so it was relatively small, but I recommend if in a bigger game, you probably want to plan ahead a little bit and organize this, because it could get pretty big pretty quick. So to keep me organized, I created a struct asset with values that I wanted to change for each state. And you can see just over here where I have a default state, which was when she was walking, and that was what I set everything off to look good by default. And then for running, mounting, canter when she was on the horse or galloping, and then also I have a special settings for when she was on the Vista. So I set up the struct asset, and I would, this was kind of the first time that I had set this up, and I would err on adding more attributes to the struct than less attributes, because it's always easier just to, it's easier to have those than go back and add them. So if I was to do this again, I would have probably added more cloth values by default. And then for perf reasons, you'll probably at some point would want to nativize this as well, this blueprint. Okay, so the cloth controller function reads in various variables like booleans, like is she on the horse, and floats like speed 2D, how fast is she going? And then based off of those values, cloth attributes are then updated on the fly. At the Vista, a state set where it says, hey, I'm at the Vista. And then I change and update wind variables and wind values, things like lift and drag and a bunch of other things, just to get a little more dramatic effect for when she's at that spot. And then when Siri mounts the horse, I have on the animation, I set a meta curve that just says, hey, this is the mount left or this is the mount right. And then based off of those, I set actually use a little bit of wind values and other things to kind of help get the cloak up and over there, and then set friction and a bunch of stuff like that, just again, based off of whatever she's doing. All right, let's talk about velocity scale. Velocity scale is a node that's in the cloth graph, and it is huge to help control your simulation. So the velocity scale controls how much movement is inherited from the world space, and there are clamps for velocity and acceleration, as well as an overall scale. And this video just shows a quick example of how it can affect your simulation. And I set velocity scale on pretty much every state she's in. It allows you to control all the motion that's coming into that simulation. So that's the node, the velocity scale. You have both linear and angular control. And then so there's a velocity scale, and then there's also clamps. And I prefer to use the clamps on the velocity over the scale, because in the scale node, or excuse me, Alex and I were talking earlier, is a good example. Scale, if somebody's running at 1 mile per hour at a fastest scale, essentially just, if you put it at 0.5, they're now going, it acts like he's going half that speed. Versus a scale clamp, versus the clamp, it doesn't do anything until it hits that point and then clamps it, won't let it go any further. So I felt like the clamp worked really well, because I still wanted a lot of motion and activity, I guess, in the cloth. And the scale worked really well, and the clamp worked very well because it wouldn't let too much information get passed into it. Here I set the max linear velocity based off of if Siri is running or walking, and then the velocity scale is a vector value, so you have control over X, Y, and Z. To avoid popping between the transitions, I also created an f-interp function that just smooth blend between the different values, so you didn't get the pop. This video shows the effective velocity scale as Siri is walking and running around. So more motion is applied in the forward axis to help push the cloak back, and also in the up and down axis to give a little bit more movement up and down. So one of the problems that we ran into was the collisions on her feet would sometimes get caught up in the bottom of her cape because it's pretty long. And so just giving a little bit more velocity in that direction just helped push it out a little further. The same principle is applied to Siri when she's mounted on the horse. So based off of speed, I update the velocity scale, as well as lift and drag and friction, and also the warp weft scale. I also I end up shrinking the cape a little bit, just to, we didn't want to cover up all of the horse with her cloak, and it also just made it behave a little nicer. So yeah, she goes into gallop, I ramp into some different variables just to help get that cloak up and make it look a little more dynamic. All right, let's talk about the anim mesh. So in your cloth asset, you have the simulation mesh, and then you have the render mesh. And the simulation mesh is based off of your anim mesh, or it's the base mesh. And so consider this is essentially the foundation of your simulation. And that anim mesh totally influences influence what your simulation is doing. So like max distance, anim drive, backstops, resets, they're all based off of your anim mesh position. So in here you can see the base pose for when Siri is riding on the horse. That purple mesh it's swept over to the side to keep it away from the scabbards, because the scabbards were very tricky, and it would get caught up a lot. So we helped art direct it to that side, and then just to help keep them away, and also avoid penetrations with the other saddle and other things in the back. This is Siri's base walk pose, or just when she's running around. So the other thing was we wanted to make sure that purple mesh wasn't clipping with the scabbards by default, and that's I kind of spread it out a little bit just to help. I felt like it gave a little more flair when it was walking around. And all these same things apply to the hood as well. I have a base mesh starting post for the hood. And again, same principles apply for that. So you can influence the sim mesh by rigging and posing the animesh, basically giving you art directability. So you can see here the pretty basic rigs set up in the animesh, and you could go as crazy as you wanted, but you don't have to have it. But again, that gives you the ability to art direct and kind of guide the simulation a bit more. One of the cool things that Alex mentioned as well is we just added morph targets, which is really super awesome because one of the things we ran into is the hood we would animate down, and while it worked pretty well, it still was a little bit crunchy as far as the mesh goes. The meshes weren't super clean. And so I was like, hey, Alex, would be really cool. And so Alex hooked me up. And so now we have morph targets so I trigger a morph target in the animated pose just to clean up the edges, and then it really helps the cloth behave a lot nicer. And we could have done that for the horse as well. Like you could even have a nice simulated pose on the back of the horse and then use that. All right, so attribute maps. This is something that ended up being a kind of a bigger deal than I thought it was going to be. So obviously you have attribute maps that you paint in the cloth asset editor for max distance and all your different things, which is really cool. But something that we ended up doing was it's possible to swap maps on the fly. So going back to the hood, when the hood was up, I had a max distance map painted and that worked really well for when the hood is up. But at any point in time, Siri could take her hood on or off. And when she took it off, like the map worked, but I could see a little bit of kind of fighting and stuff like that. And so I ended up painting another map for when the hood was down. And then I have a variable again that says when the hood's down, we swap maps and then use the map, that max distance map, which the hood is down. And that, again, just gives me another level of control that when it's down or in a different position, we can swap it on the fly. And then I just hide the transition, or I had the pop essentially when the hood is going down. So again, depending on whatever situation and you could swap maps, which is really cool. All right, so let's talk about some CVARs. CVARs essentially are debug features that help us see what's going on in the engine. And they're really important to help debug and understand what is actually going on. So here are some of the CVARs that I use the most. And I just wanted to highlight them because, again, I think they're super important. So the first one is, well, let's start over there. So in order to turn or see any of these, you have to have the debug enable function, so that p.chaos debug enabled. That one turns the debug draw on or off. You have to have it on to see any of these. So once you have that turned on, the one kind of in the top left there is the debug draw collision that actually shows you your collision shapes and for just the cloth asset itself. And so you can see what's going on there. The next one is the animesh, which is the purple one. Again, that showing what's my base mesh doing. That was a huge deal for me to understand what's actually happening. Is it in the right pose? And things like that. Another one is the debug draw teleport reset. This is a new one that Alex added, especially during cinematics when we would get pops in between transitions. We weren't sure, was it teleporting? Did it reset? Like what happened? And so that will turn green, that mesh will turn green if there's a teleport that's happening, or it will turn red if a reset is happening. So it helped us understand, what just happened. And then the other one in the bottom right here is, you can hopefully kind of see it in the transition, but it's the draw in foreground. So by default, the wire mesh draws through the mesh, and I find it to be kind of distracting and not super helpful. So that actually makes the wireframe not draw through, and is something that I like to use most of the time. The one other CVAR that I ended up using a lot is the T override FPS, and what that does is it forces Pi to use whatever frame rate you specify, even if it has to slow down the play rate. And what that does is essentially gave me more accurate visuals in the editor for what the cloth would actually do when it's running at actual 60 FPS. So sometimes in Pi, depending on various performance things, you may or may not get super accurate results, and so this helped really dial in. And then actually one trick that I use this a lot too is going through cinematics. Sometimes we had long cinematics. I would just turn the frame rate to 5 FPS, and then it would just essentially fast forward so I could just see the part that I needed. So a little trick. So there's a ton of CVARs, and depending on what you're doing, it's really hard to remember all of the things and what they do. So income editor utility widgets. So utility widgets are really great for this very thing. This is just a small example of what I did. Based off all the different things, I just made a little widget with easy buttons that just turn on and off CVARs, which really helps speed up time and debugging, because trying to remember the exact names and everything like that was pretty difficult. So the nice thing about utility widgets too is they're actually really easy to just move on to other projects and things like that, copy over, it's, in my opinion, totally worth the effort making a utility widget, especially for a bigger project where you're going to be doing a lot of work. All right, let's talk about just we call the special case toolbox. There's every part in a project that has, you kind of have like your main flow of things and you kind of figure that out, but then there's always exceptions to the rule. And so these were some of the solutions that I did to kind of help for those more unique solutions. All right, so we'll talk about the Vista Wind, show you some collision tricks, how I use control rig, and then some things that we learned from the cinematics. So the Vista Wind, there's a volume trigger set up because it was a very specific, unique area in the world, and we knew at that specific point we wanted to have specific things done. So I just set up a volume trigger, which has an overlap event that says, hey, I'm at the Vista, and then based in the controller function, I look for that variable, and when it's at that variable, I set those specific wind values and like the cloth attributes like lift and drag and all that kind of stuff. Again, just to get a more cinematic, a little more dramatic effect there. And that's the only spot I use those values. So one of the great things is to be able to dynamically add and remove collisions. So by default, Siri doesn't know, the cloth doesn't know about the horse and has any collisions for that in the physics asset, because you don't want to carry around all those extra physics assets or physics capsules when you didn't need to. So the add collision source is a node that you can use to dynamically add and remove collisions. So when Siri gets on the horse, we run this function. I set up those collisions on the horse asset itself. We trigger this, it adds those collisions. So then now when Siri's on the horse, the cloak can react appropriately to what's to collide with the horse. And then when she gets off the horse, we dump those collisions so we don't have to pay for them or use them anymore. And the cool thing for this as well is that works for R-band as well. So any like rigid body dynamics, you can dynamically add and remove. So if you had like a backpack or something in a hair and you needed to collide with that, you can add and remove collisions. So that's a really cool node. One new feature we added to capsules was a one-sided collision. It might be kind of hard to see, but in the top, one of the issues we had with a collapsible and kind of the tail of the hood was as Siri's head would turn, it would kind of wrap around the capsule. And so what this one-sided collision does is in the positive X, it always pushes out that way and just helps prevent your cloth from wrapping around basically to the backside. The other thing is, so we mentioned this before, the scabbards were always really tricky to keep them out of the cloth and getting tangled up. And so during the mounting sequence, I actually do have a bone above the collision object that I just animate up a little bit out of the way. So as she's kind of throwing her legs around, we just slightly move those scabbards, collisions up out of the way, just give it a little more breathing room and get over to the edge. So when it can get over the horse, and then we can slide them back down once it's there. So just feel free to cheat. External collisions. So in the demo, there's this little sequence right here where she goes through the kind of a tight spot in the cliff. And collisions can be, or external collisions having on all the time is kind of expensive. And so it's the same trick here. I had a collision box that said, hey, I'm at the spot. I temporarily turn on the external collisions. And then in the collision, in the world, we have a couple capsules set up against the cliff there. And then as she goes through it, we get a nice collision with it. And then as soon as she leaves it, I turn the collision back off, so we're not paying for it. All right, control rig. One of the other issues that we kind of ran into, so the hood by default in the skeleton is parented to the base neck. And so, which is great for when the hood is up, it follows the head and does what it needs to there. But when the hood is off, I didn't want it to follow the neck, I wanted it to follow the spine. And one of the problems too with that was the animesh, when it was rotating with the spine, it would like kind of clip through and push through some of the shoulder, causing it to really get jittery and cause some problems. So we came up with a pretty easy control rig to simply basically follow the neck when the hood is up and follow the spine when we were done, or when it was down. So really easy and worked really well, and saved us a bunch of heartache actually. So also control rig, there's this, it's called the spherical pose reader, and this is one of my new favorite functions, but basically here we have, again, the hood tail with her scabbards. It was clipping and just like, it was just right at the perfect spot to cause problems, basically is what it was. And so with this spherical pose reader in the animesh itself, what I did was set up that vector, and you set up that the sphere and the green spots where it's 100%, and then it fades off basically based on that. So as she turns her head, I just physically animated that tail down to get it out of the way and to help the cloth and collision just not have to fight so much against the capsule for the scabbard. I also do that for the arm swing. So as Siri's kind of walking or running, we were getting a lot of kind of like just issues from hitting her elbow against the cape. And so same thing, I have a vector that points down to a pose reader. And then as her arm basically gets to this position, I essentially push back. There's a joint on the cape that I just push back a little bit and kind of rotate. And again, just gives it a little more breathing room and doesn't have to fight so hard with the collision. All right, let's talk about cinematic sequences real quick. So pre-posing, pre-pose if possible. So put characters in the correct pose on the frame before the cut, and this will give physics a chance to to get into the right pose and settle before you actually get on the, actually view that camera. It sounds simple, or it sounds straightforward, but it makes a huge difference. It really does. That's not always possible, but especially when you do, like you're doing back and forth cutscenes between characters, if you can keep the characters within relative position, it makes a huge difference. We fought a lot of pops and different things like that, and just pre-posing made a big difference. Event tracks. So in sequencer, although sequencer evaluates ranges of time, property tracks only apply the keyed value of the current time, regardless of how many keys we've crossed between the last frame and the current frame. Basically, keys, depending on your current time, it's possible for them to get skipped. So event tracks are different. They will deterministically trigger in the order they appear on the timeline and are guaranteed to be triggered even if they don't land exactly on an evaluated time. So if we have, say we need to do a teleport or a reset or something on the clock, on the cloth, and you set a keyframe, depending on how good your frame time is, it may or may not get evaluated versus an event, it always fires. So things that are really critical and that you need to hit for sure on certain frames, use events. Okay, so shot specific functions, creating specific functions in the blueprint, the sequencer blueprint. It gives you that opportunity to, for whatever that shot needs, you can kind of do a little bit of magic there that only applies to there. We'll talk a little bit real quick about teleport and reset and how we tackled some of those. This is kind of my order of operation. First, do no harm and teleport. Teleport removes any external forces and essentially pauses the current pose of the cloth and then resumes it in that same pose after the teleport. And this should work for most situations, especially if you pre-pose or anything like that. Teleporting is usually the best way to go. The next one is reset. Reset will restart your simulation based off the current animation pose. So going back to that purple wireframe, whatever that pose is in is what reset will put your cloth in. So for example, if Siri was on the horse and her cloth was in the walking default pose, that's just down, and I hit a reset, that would start the cloth inside the collision, and then it would pop out. So it's really important to make sure that your animesh is in the right pose, especially when you do reset. Sometimes that doesn't always work, but global dampening is the next one that I use a lot, where I had a function that would turn global dampening all the way up to 1 just for one frame, and then I'd ramp it back down, and that seemed to work very well. All right, so one of the things that I wish I'd known this before at the start of the project was the fur cards ended up, I wish what I had done is on the simulation mesh. Right now the simulation mesh it just does the main cape. It's in the shape of the main cape and doesn't take into account for the extra width of the fur cards. I wish I had gone back and made the simulation mesh go all the way out to the edges of the fur cards. It would have mapped a lot better in the proxy node, and then the collisions would have been better because you have an actual edge on the fur cards, and that would have prevented some kind of weird pops and that happened there. So that was one thing that I wish I had done more. All right, so again, knowing that we had a 60 hertz frame target and 300 plus simulated vertices, we knew that there was just going to be some compromises because, man, we had to hit those targets and we knew we couldn't have it all. So some of those things were like juicy folds, right? Because there's only so much resolution and like every vert counts. Like getting super intricate folds just probably wasn't really going to be that big of a reality for us. Perfect collisions, again, we're working with low res. While we had really good collisions, actually, I think we did really well, and we were able to keep this cloth out of the scabbards, which was a big deal. We still were able to make it work. You're going to have a low vert count, especially if you're going to be hitting performance targets. That's just a reality of it right now. And then corrective blueprint work will be likely, like I showed you in the cloth controller function. There's just, again, you can't rely 100% on the simulation itself, like self collisions and things like that. So you're going to have to do a little bit of fix-up work to help smooth things over. So hopefully we've shown you that you can get really great results with Chaos Cloth in games. I'm really happy with how things turned out, and we thought it worked and looks really good. And hopefully, this inspires you to do more cloth in your games and projects. And with a little bit of hard work, you can have really awesome cloth as well. Thank you, appreciate it. We'll do a little bit of Q&A. I'll have Alex come back up. I appreciate it, everybody coming today, and hopefully we'll get some help.